80-year-old Lillian Johnson chose to enter a nursing home to avoid being a burden to her family. But behind closed doors lay cruelty. Locked in a dark room with broken cameras, she endured bruises and threats in silence, until a young volunteer discovered her. With no evidence other than courage, Lillian spoke out in court. A frail witness confirmed the truth. The system changed, and so did her life. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you watching today? And if you believe that courage always works wonders, then this story is for you. Chicago in late October carried a sharp wind off Lake Michigan, the kind that slipped beneath coats and whispered that winter was near. On the south side, rows of aging brick houses stood close together, their porches creaking under decades of seasons. The sky was a pale gray, and fallen leaves skittered across cracked sidewalks like restless memories. Lillian Mae Johnson had lived on this block for more than 50 years. At 80 years old, Lillian was small in frame but steady in presence. She stood barely 5 feet tall, her build slender and slightly stooped with age. Yet there remained a quiet dignity in the way she held her shoulders. Her skin was a deep, warm brown, lined gently by time rather than defeated by it. Fine silver-gray hair was always gathered into a neat low bun at the nape of her neck, a habit she had kept since her 20s when she worked double shifts and needed it out of her face. Her eyes were dark, thoughtful, and observant, the kind of eyes that had seen both injustice and grace and learned to survive both. Her modest wooden house had once been painted cream, but now the color had faded into something closer to memory than paint. The front steps sagged slightly, and the porch railing bore the marks of countless Chicago winters. Inside, the walls were filled with framed photographs. Her late husband Thomas in his Army uniform, her son Marcus as a boy holding a baseball, 2 grandchildren grinning with missing teeth. Thomas Johnson had died 6 years earlier after a long battle with heart disease. He had been tall and broad-shouldered, a factory worker with calloused hands and a gentle laugh. His absence still felt like an unfinished sentence in the house. Since his passing, the rooms had grown quieter and Lillian had grown more reflective. Now she lived with her son Marcus, his wife Angela, and their 2 children. Marcus Johnson, 45 years old, had inherited his father's height but not his ease. He stood over 6 feet tall, with a solid, hard-working build shaped by years of construction labor. His skin was a rich mahogany tone, his hair cropped short with faint threads of gray at the temples. His jaw was strong, his expression often serious, softened only when he looked at his children. Responsibility had etched itself into his posture. Since his father's death, Marcus carried not only his own family but his mother's care on his shoulders. He loved her fiercely, but he was tired. Angela Johnson, 42, moved through the house with quiet efficiency. She was of medium height, slender, with warm brown skin and expressive almond-shaped eyes that revealed more emotion than she intended. Her dark hair, streaked faintly with early silver, was usually tied back in a loose bun. Angela worked part-time as a medical receptionist. She was kind, patient with the children, respectful to Lillian. But there were evenings when the strain showed in the way she pressed her lips together or lingered silently at the kitchen sink. She never complained, but she felt the weight. 8-year-old Sophie, Lillian's granddaughter, was bright and curious, with tight curls framing her round face and wide brown eyes that sparkled with questions. She loved drawing pictures for her grandmother and listening to stories about the old days. Her younger brother Caleb, 5, energetic and perpetually in motion, adored climbing onto Lillian's lap, even though she no longer had the strength to lift him easily. Lillian watched them all carefully. She noticed how Marcus rubbed his temples after late shifts. She saw Angela calculating grocery expenses at the kitchen table. She heard the whispered discussions about school fees, rising rent, medical bills. They never told her she was a burden. But Lillian had lived long enough to read what was not spoken. One evening, as the wind rattled the kitchen window and the smell of Angela's chicken stew filled the house, Lillian folded her hands in her lap and cleared her throat. "Marcus, she began softly. He looked up from his phone. Yes, Mama? She met his eyes directly. I've been thinking. Maybe it's time I move somewhere with more care. A place made for people my age. The room stilled. Angela froze for a fraction of a second before lowering herself slowly into a chair. Marcus frowned. What are you talking about? A nursing home, Lillian said, her voice calm but firm. I don't want to be in the way. You're not in the way, Marcus replied instantly, almost sharply. His reaction came from love, but also from fear. Fear that he had somehow failed her. Lillian reached across the table, placing her small hand over his large one. Baby, I raised you to stand strong. Let me stand strong now. Angela swallowed. Guilt flickered across her face. Part of her wanted to protest, to insist Lillian stay. Another part, the exhausted part, felt a quiet, shameful relief. Marcus shook his head. We can manage. You already are managing too much, Lillian said gently. She had done her research in secret. Over the past month, she had spoken to a social worker at church, browsed websites at the public library, and requested brochures. One name kept appearing. Willow Creek Senior Living, located in a quieter suburb north of the city. The website showed sunlit gardens, smiling staff members, and bright communal rooms. The slogan read, A second home, filled with light and compassion. Light. Compassion. Two things she believed she deserved. Marcus exhaled slowly. I heard something about that place, he said after a pause. A guy at work said they treat the low-income residents differently. It was something he had heard in passing months earlier, nothing concrete. Still, it lingered in his mind like a warning bell. Lillian nodded thoughtfully. Rumors follow every place, Marcus. Angela spoke carefully. Maybe we could visit first. Lillian had already completed most of the application forms. She was determined, not because she felt unloved, but because she refused to be the reason her family bent under pressure. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Marcus sat alone in the living room. The television flickered silently. He stared at his father's old armchair and wondered what Thomas would have advised. His loyalty to his mother wrestled with his pride. In her bedroom, Lillian packed slowly. She folded her dresses neatly, placed Thomas's photograph into a small wooden frame, and tucked Sophie's crayon drawings between pages of her Bible. The next morning dawned colder than the last. A thin mist clung to the air. Sophie stood by the front door, clutching a handmade card. You'll call me every night, Grandma? Every night, Lillian promised, bending carefully to kiss her forehead. Caleb hugged her waist tightly. Don't forget us. I couldn't if I tried, she said with a small laugh. Angela embraced her mother-in-law, whispering, Thank you. For everything. The words carried gratitude and apology all at once. Marcus loaded her suitcase into the car. His movements were stiff, controlled. As they drove away from the south side, Lillian looked back at the fading outline of the house. She had entered that home as a young bride. She was leaving it as a widow and matriarch. The city skyline shimmered faintly through the gray. She felt something between sorrow and relief. Willow Creek Senior Living appeared polished and quiet from the outside, surrounded by trimmed hedges and a decorative fountain now drained for winter. The building's brick exterior looked modern compared to her aging home. Marcus parked. He turned to her. If anything feels wrong, you tell me. Immediately. Lillian smiled softly. I will. She believed she had made the right choice. She believed she was stepping into a place of care, not compromise. And as she crossed the threshold of Willow Creek for the first time, carrying a lifetime of resilience in a single suitcase, she told herself one steady truth. She was not giving up. She was choosing dignity. The lobby of Willow Creek Senior Living smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and artificial lavender. Soft instrumental music floated from hidden speakers in the ceiling. The floors gleamed, the lighting warm and carefully arranged to create comfort. On the wall behind the reception desk hung a large, framed slogan in gold lettering: "A second home, filled with light and compassion." Lillian noticed the word light immediately. It lingered in her mind. Rebecca Collins was the first staff member assigned to her intake. Rebecca appeared to be in her early 30s, tall and slim with sharply angled shoulders and straight blonde hair pulled tightly into a low ponytail. Her complexion was pale, almost porcelain under the fluorescent lights, and her blue eyes were clear but distant. She wore her navy scrubs crisply pressed, her name badge aligned perfectly at her chest. Everything about her suggested discipline and efficiency. There was no visible cruelty in her posture, only a brisk detachment that felt colder than open hostility. "Mrs. Johnson?" Rebecca asked without smiling. "Yes," Lillian replied gently. Rebecca did not extend her hand. Instead, she flipped through a clipboard. "We'll complete your intake forms and then I'll show you your room." Her voice was clipped, precise as if every extra word cost something. Marcus stood beside his mother, observing carefully. His broad frame seemed almost too large for the quiet lobby. He nodded politely, but his gaze remained alert. At that moment, the glass doors at the entrance opened again. Another elderly woman entered, accompanied by a middle-aged man who appeared to be her son. The woman's name, Lillian would soon learn, was Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor was in her late 70s, slightly taller than Lillian, with softly curled white hair framing a round, rosy face. Her build was fuller, her hands adorned with a thin gold bracelet and wedding ring. She wore a pale blue wool coat and carried herself with the relaxed confidence of someone accustomed to comfort. Her voice carried lightly when she laughed at something her son said. Rebecca's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. She turned toward Eleanor with a small but visible smile. "Mrs. Whitmore, welcome. We've prepared several options for you to view." Several options. Marcus noticed. Lillian noticed. Rebecca guided Eleanor and her son down a bright hallway to the left of the lobby. The corridor was wide, lined with framed watercolor paintings and small potted plants placed under skylights. Sunlight streamed through tall windows at the end of that wing. Lillian and Marcus waited in the reception area for nearly 15 minutes before Rebecca returned. The warmth had disappeared from her expression. "Mrs. Johnson, your room has been assigned. Room 214. "May we see others?" Marcus asked calmly. Rebecca glanced at the clipboard. "All assignments are finalized based on availability and care requirements." Her tone left little room for discussion. They followed her down a different hallway. This one was narrower. The overhead lights flickered faintly in places, casting a colder hue. The paintings here were older, some slightly crooked. The air felt stiller. Room 214 sat at the very end of the corridor. The door was painted the same neutral beige as the walls. A small number plate hung slightly tilted. Rebecca opened it. The room was modest, but the first thing Lillian noticed was the window. It was small and partially obstructed by the brick wall of the neighboring building. The daylight that filtered through was thin and gray. The air carried a faint heaviness as if circulation were limited. "There's minimal foot traffic here," Rebecca explained briskly. "Quieter." Marcus stepped toward the window, testing the latch. It opened only a few inches. Lillian moved slowly around the room. A narrow bed, a dresser, a single chair upholstered in faded green fabric. "It feels a bit dim," she said gently. "Are there brighter rooms available?" Rebecca shook her head. "We are at capacity." From the hallway came the distant sound of Eleanor's laughter drifting from the sunlit wing. Marcus's jaw tightened. "You're certain?" Rebecca's smile did not reach her eyes. "Assignments are determined by the administrative office." Lillian sensed the tension rising. She did not want confrontation on her first day. She touched Marcus's arm lightly. "It's all right," she said softly. Rebecca placed the key on the small bedside table. "Dinner is at 6. Staff will assist you as needed." Then she left. Silence settled into the room. Marcus exhaled sharply. "Mama, if you're uncomfortable, we can reconsider." Lillian walked toward the window again. She traced the edge of the sill with her fingers. The light was weaker than she had imagined when browsing the website photos. But she reminded herself that comfort was not measured only in sunlight. "I will be fine," she said. "It's just the first day." Marcus studied her face, searching for doubt. He found none. Only resolve. Across the hallway, a door creaked open slightly. An elderly woman with thin silver hair, pulled back in a loose bun, observed quietly. Margaret O'Connor was 82, originally from a working-class Irish-American family on Chicago's North Side. Her face was narrow, her cheekbones sharp beneath translucent skin. Her eyes were a faded green that seemed permanently watchful. Years earlier, Margaret had worked as a school librarian. She had lost her husband to cancer and later her daughter in a car accident. Those losses had carved caution into her spirit, but also deepened her empathy. She spoke rarely, but she noticed everything. Margaret watched as Marcus carried in Lillian's suitcase. She noticed which hallway Lillian had been brought down. She had lived at Willow Creek long enough to recognize patterns in assignments. That evening, Marcus stayed until dinner was announced. The dining hall assigned to Lillian's wing was smaller than the one Eleanor had entered earlier. The tables were arranged closer together. Most of the residents seated there were people of color or individuals whose clothing suggested more modest means. Rebecca moved between tables efficiently, distributing trays. Her manner remained professional but distant. Marcus leaned toward his mother. "Call me if anything feels off." "I will," Lillian promised. When he finally left, the room felt larger and emptier at once. Later, back in room 214, Lillian unpacked slowly. She placed Thomas's photograph on the dresser and set Sophie's drawings along the wall near the bed. The small room began to feel slightly warmer with pieces of her past inside it. A gentle knock sounded at the door. Margaret stood there, leaning lightly on a wooden cane polished smooth with use. "Evening," she said in a soft but clear voice. "I'm Margaret," across the hall. Lillian smiled. "Lillian." Margaret stepped inside, her gaze scanning the room briefly. She did not comment on the lighting. She did not comment on the window, but her eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary. "They put you here first day?" Margaret asked. "Yes," Lillian replied. Margaret nodded slowly, as if confirming a private observation. "If you need anything, knock twice on my door." Her offer was simple, but sincere. After Margaret left, Lillian sat on the edge of her bed and listened. The hallway grew quieter as night approached. Somewhere farther down, a television played faintly. Laughter drifted from the brighter wing again, muffled by distance. At 8 o'clock, her phone rang. Marcus's name flashed on the screen. "How is it?" he asked immediately. Lillian looked around the dim room. She glanced at the small window, the narrow bed, the muted light. She imagined Marcus sitting on the edge of the couch at home, waiting for reassurance. "It's all right," she said gently. "Everyone's been kind." There was a brief pause on the other end. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." After they hung up, Lillian lay back carefully. The ceiling above her was plain, painted white, slightly uneven near one corner. She folded her hands over her chest and closed her eyes. She had expected adjustment. She had expected unfamiliarity. She had not expected the subtle distance in Rebecca's eyes or the visible difference in how Eleanor had been welcomed. It was not loud discrimination. It was not spoken, but it was present. As the hallway lights dimmed automatically at 10, casting longer shadows beneath her door, Lillian understood something quietly and without bitterness. She had not entered the same Willow Creek shown in the brochure, and she was not being received the same way as everyone else. Still, she told herself, first impressions were not final truths. Tomorrow would be another day. She turned toward the wall, facing the faint gray glow of the obstructed window, and whispered softly into the stillness, "I will be fine." But in the quiet of room 214, she began to realize she was not entirely welcomed. Morning at Willow Creek began with the hum of rolling medication carts and the faint smell of overcooked oatmeal drifting through the hallway. In the brighter wing, sunlight slid across polished floors. In the narrow corridor where room 214 sat, the light arrived late and weak, filtered through concrete and distance. Rebecca Collins maintained the same measured efficiency she had shown on intake day. Her tall frame moved swiftly between rooms, posture straight, ponytail unmoving as if discipline extended even to her hair. She rarely raised her voice. That was not her method. Instead, her authority came through pressure, small, controlled, deliberate. On Lillian's third morning, Rebecca entered without knocking. "Time for morning care," she said, already adjusting the bed controls. Lillian attempted to sit up slowly, but her joints resisted. Before she could reposition herself fully, Rebecca's hand pressed firmly against her shoulder, pushing her back down. "Hold still," she muttered. The pressure was sharper than necessary. Lillian inhaled, but said nothing. As Rebecca assisted her to the bathroom, her grip tightened around Lillian's forearm. The older woman felt the squeeze long after Rebecca released her. Later that afternoon, a faint purple shadow bloomed beneath the skin. It was small, easy to dismiss, but it did not remain the only one. Days passed in repetition. Medication cups placed briskly into her palm. Pillows adjusted with unnecessary force. Once, while repositioning Lillian in bed, Rebecca pressed her head down harder than required, flattening her silver bun against the pillow. "You need to cooperate," she said flatly, as if Lillian had resisted. The movement left a dull ache behind Lillian's ear. The camera mounted high in the corner of room 214 remained dark. A small red indicator light that should have blinked steadily never turned on. When Lillian once asked about it, Rebecca responded without looking up from her chart. Maintenance request filed. The door to her room was occasionally shut firmly from the outside. "Safety protocol," Rebecca explained one evening. "Residents in this wing wander." Lillian did not wander. Across the hall, Margaret O'Connor heard the click of that lock more than once. She had lived at Willow Creek for nearly 2 years and understood the difference between precaution and isolation. Margaret's body had grown frail, her wrists thin as twigs, but her hearing remained sharp. One morning, as Rebecca helped Lillian into a wheelchair for transport to the dining room, Margaret's door was slightly ajar. She watched as Rebecca jerked the handles too quickly, causing Lillian's shoulder to twist awkwardly against the armrest. Margaret's fingers tightened around her cane. She considered speaking then, but Rebecca's expression, cool and unapproachable, discouraged interruption. Margaret had once confronted a nurse at a different facility before transferring to Willow Creek. The complaint had resulted in weeks of subtle neglect, longer waits for assistance, colder meals. She had learned that courage sometimes carried consequences. Still, she watched. Another new presence in the hallway began to notice details as well. Daniel Brooks, 24 years old, was the newest assistant nurse assigned to the floor. He was tall, but slightly awkward in posture, his long limbs not yet fully confident in their movements. His skin was a medium, warm brown, his hair closely trimmed, his expression often thoughtful. He had graduated from community college only months earlier, the first in his family to enter healthcare. His mother had worked as a hospital cleaner for 25 years, teaching him early that employment could be fragile. Daniel believed in dignity. He believed elder care was sacred work. He also believed he could not afford to lose his job. The first time he noticed something unusual, it was during afternoon vitals. Lillian winced slightly when he wrapped the blood pressure cuff around her arm. "Too tight?" he asked gently. "No," she replied quickly. "It's fine." Her smile was polite, practiced, but when he adjusted the sleeve upward, he saw the bruise. "Did you bump into something?" he asked. "Just clumsy these days," Lillian said, deflecting. Daniel nodded, but did not fully accept the explanation. Bruises at her age were not uncommon, but the placement suggested grip marks. Later that week, he observed Rebecca guiding Lillian back into room 214. The door closed more sharply than necessary. A faint thud followed. Perhaps the bed frame against the wall. Perhaps nothing. Daniel hesitated in the hallway. He considered knocking. Instead, he continued pushing his supply cart forward. Fear was quiet but powerful. Inside the room, Lillian felt herself withdrawing. She began speaking less during care routines. She responded to instructions quickly to avoid irritation. When Rebecca entered, Lillian's muscles tightened instinctively, bracing before touch arrived. The bruises deepened. On her upper arms, near her shoulder blade, along her rib cage where an elbow had pressed too sharply during repositioning. One afternoon, Rebecca adjusted the bed angle abruptly. Lillian's body slid slightly before Rebecca caught her, fingers digging into her side to stabilize her. Pain shot through her ribs. "Stop being difficult," Rebecca muttered, though Lillian had not resisted. That evening, while changing into her nightgown, Lillian examined herself carefully in the small bathroom mirror. The purple marks contrasted against her dark skin, subtle but undeniable. She pressed her fingers lightly against one. Tender. For the first time, doubt flickered where certainty had lived. This was not the light she had chosen. At dinner the following day, Margaret positioned her wheelchair closer than usual. "You're quieter," Margaret observed gently. "I'm adjusting," Lillian replied. Margaret's faded green eyes studied her for a long moment. Adjustment shouldn't hurt. Lillian did not answer. The atmosphere of the wing had grown subtly tense. Other residents rarely spoke about their treatment, but small signs accumulated. Long waits for assistance, dismissive tones, doors closed longer than necessary. None of it loud enough to label abuse. All of it quiet enough to endure. Daniel began documenting minor inconsistencies in his personal notebook. Nothing official, just timestamps. Room 214, door locked at 2:10 p.m. Resident not scheduled for isolation. Camera non-functional since intake. He told himself it was for clarity, not accusation. One morning, as Rebecca repositioned Lillian in bed, her grip slipped and her fingernails scraped across Lillian's shoulder. The scratch was shallow but visible, a thin red line against dark skin. Margaret saw it clearly from the hallway. Rebecca straightened, expression unchanged. "Be more careful," she said to Lillian, though the fault had not been hers. That night, Lillian lay awake longer than usual. The ceiling above her felt lower, the air heavier. She remembered Marcus's words, "If anything feels wrong, you tell me." But what counted as wrong? There was no shouting, no visible rage, no broken bones, only pressure, only bruises, only the slow erosion of comfort. She had spent a lifetime enduring systems that required silence. She had told herself she would never allow herself to be diminished again. Yet here she was, calculating how much discomfort was tolerable before complaint became necessary. In the hallway, Daniel paused outside room 214 after finishing his shift. He almost knocked. Instead, he wrote one final note in his small notebook and slipped it into his pocket. Margaret sat by her dim lamp across the hall, listening to the quiet clicks of locks and distant wheels. Her hands trembled slightly, not from age alone, but from decision forming slowly inside her. And in the dim light of her small room, Lillian folded her hands over her chest once more. Her trust had not vanished, but it had begun to fracture. She did not cry. She did not shout. She simply grew quieter, and the bruises remained. The morning the visitors arrived, Willow Creek moved differently. The usual quiet hum of routine sharpened into performance. Fresh flowers appeared in the lobby vases. The faint stain near the reception desk was covered by a decorative rug. Staff uniforms looked more pressed than usual, and name badges were checked twice. Room 214 remained at the end of the dim corridor, unchanged. Lillian noticed the difference in sound before she understood the reason. Voices, brighter, unfamiliar, floated down the hallway. A burst of laughter. The squeak of polished shoes not yet accustomed to the building's floors. Margaret knocked twice on Lillian's door before entering. "Something's happening," she said quietly. "Outreach group. Happens every few months." Lillian adjusted the shawl over her shoulders. The bruise along her upper arm had faded from deep purple to a dull yellow, but tenderness remained. "Do they come here?" she asked. Margaret gave a thin smile. "They go where they're guided." In the lobby, Charles Whitman stood near the entrance greeting guests. Charles was in his late 50s, tall with a broad but slightly softened build that came from years behind a desk rather than physical labor. His salt-and-pepper hair was combed neatly back, and he wore a charcoal suit that fit well enough to signal authority but not extravagance. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced. He had worked in long-term care administration for nearly 2 decades. In his early career, he had entered the field believing in service. Over time, paperwork, budgets, and liability concerns had reshaped him into a cautious manager who valued reputation above discomfort. Beside him stood Linda Park, the facility's social coordinator. Linda was a petite Korean-American woman in her early 40s, with short black hair tucked neatly behind her ears and a warm, earnest expression. She wore a soft lavender cardigan over her blouse and carried a clipboard decorated with colorful stickers. Linda genuinely loved the residents and often organized craft afternoons or music sessions. But she did not control room assignments, and she rarely questioned staffing decisions. The visitors entered in a small group of 6. Among them was Ava Thompson. Ava was 22 years old, tall and lean with a natural athletic grace. Her skin was a warm, light brown. Her curly dark hair pulled into a loose, high ponytail that bounced when she walked. Her eyes were sharp and attentive, the kind that lingered on details others missed. She wore a simple denim jacket over a cream sweater and carried a small notebook tucked under her arm. A camera hung from her shoulder, though she used it sparingly. Ava was in her final year studying journalism at a state university. Her interest in elder advocacy came from her grandmother, who had once endured neglect in a different facility. That experience had sharpened Ava's instinct to look beyond polished surfaces. Charles gestured toward the brighter wing first. "We're proud of our community atmosphere," he said smoothly. "Residents enjoy shared activities and personalized care." Laughter echoed from the sunlit common room as Eleanor Whitmore played cards with 2 other residents. Ava smiled politely, but her gaze drifted toward the opposite hallway, the narrower one. "Do all residents have equal access to these spaces?" she asked casually. Charles's smile held steady. "Of course." Linda stepped in gently. "Would you like to meet some of our newer residents?" They moved down the dimmer corridor. The lighting shifted colder overhead. Ava's expression changed slightly, though she said nothing at first. When they reached room 214, the air felt heavier. Ava paused before entering, catching the faint scent of damp fabric and stale ventilation. It was subtle, but noticeable to someone attentive. Rebecca Collins stood nearby, posture upright, arms folded lightly at her waist. Her face remained composed, though her eyes sharpened when she saw the visitors approach this particular door. Linda knocked. "Mrs. Johnson, we have guests." Lillian looked up from the Bible resting in her lap. She had grown thinner in the weeks since arrival. Not drastically, but enough that her cheekbones appeared more pronounced. Still, she offered a warm smile. "Please come in." Ava stepped inside first. Her gaze moved quickly. Window size, wall discoloration near the vent, the inactive camera in the corner. She wrinkled her nose slightly. "Is the ventilation working properly in here?" she asked. Charles cleared his throat. "Maintenance is scheduled for periodic checks." Ava walked closer to Lillian and crouched down so their eyes were level. "Hi, I'm Ava. We're visiting from the Southside Community Outreach Initiative." Her voice carried sincerity without pity. Lillian noticed that immediately. "Lillian Johnson," she replied softly. Ava glanced around again. "How long have you been in this room?" "A few weeks." "Do you like it?" The question hung between them. Margaret had once said adjustment shouldn't hurt. Lillian hesitated. She was aware of Rebecca's presence behind Ava. A silent pressure in the room. "It's quiet," she said carefully. Ava's eyes narrowed slightly, not in judgment, but in curiosity. She reached gently for Lillian's hand. At the contact, Lillian flinched. The reaction was small, but unmistakable. Ava paused. "Did I hurt you?" "No," Lillian answered quickly. Too quickly. Ava's fingers moved lightly to adjust the sleeve of Lillian's cardigan. "May I?" she asked before lifting the fabric slightly. The bruises were faint but visible, yellowed at the edges, deeper near the center. The room seemed to constrict. "What happened?" Ava asked quietly. Rebecca stepped forward smoothly. "Mrs. Johnson bruises easily. Age-related fragility." Ava looked up at her. "And the scratch?" The thin line near Lillian's shoulder had not fully faded. Charles shifted uncomfortably. "We document all incidents," he said. "Our staff is trained." Margaret, who had maneuvered her wheelchair just outside the doorway, watched with sharp focus. Ava's voice remained calm. "Mrs. Johnson, do you feel safe here?" The question was direct, unshielded. Rebecca's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Lillian's heartbeat quickened. For weeks she had measured her words carefully. Silence had felt like protection. "If you speak, it will get worse." Rebecca's whisper came later, but the threat had been forming long before it was spoken. For now, the room waited. Lillian began, then stopped. She saw Marcus's face in her mind. She remembered his instruction. "If anything feels wrong, you tell me." Before she could answer, Charles interjected smoothly. "Mrs. Johnson has adjusted well. Our residents often take time to settle." Ava did not move. "I would like to speak with her privately, if that's all right." Rebecca's jaw tightened. Facility policy requires staff presence during external visits. Linda hesitated, sensing tension she did not fully understand. The moment passed without resolution. The group moved on to other rooms. As they stepped back into the hallway, Rebecca leaned close to Lillian's ear under the pretense of adjusting her blanket. Her voice was low, controlled. "If you say anything untrue to outsiders, your comfort here will change. Understand?" It was not shouted. It did not need to be. Lillian's hands trembled slightly after Rebecca left. Minutes later, Ava returned alone under the excuse of retrieving her dropped pen. She crouched again beside Lillian, her eyes softer now but determined. "My grandmother once stayed somewhere like this," Ava said quietly. "She didn't speak up. I wish she had." There was no accusation in her tone, only invitation. Lillian studied the young woman's face. She saw no mockery, no impatience, no dismissal. Only concern. Fear still hovered. Rebecca's shadow lingered in her thoughts, but something older than fear stirred within her. A memory of marches, of church meetings, of years when silence had protected systems instead of people. My room, Lillian said slowly, was not offered as a choice. Ava listened carefully. And sometimes, Lillian continued, voice barely above a whisper, care feels rough. The admission was small, but it broke something open. Ava nodded once. Thank you for telling me. When she finally left the room for good, Lillian felt both exposed and lighter. Margaret tapped her cane twice softly on the hallway floor, a silent acknowledgement. Rebecca's eyes followed the visitors until they disappeared into the lobby. Her face remained composed, but tension flickered beneath the surface. In room 214, Lillian sat still for a long moment. Her heart pounded. Her palms were damp. She was afraid, but for the first time since arriving at Willow Creek, she was not entirely alone in what she knew. And in that fragile shift between fear and courage, she made a quiet decision. She would not remain silent if asked again. The afternoon after the outreach group left, Willow Creek felt unsettled. Conversations in the hallway lowered when certain staff passed by. Doors closed more quietly. Even the rolling carts seemed to move with caution. Word traveled quickly in places built on routine, and by dinner, several residents had heard that room 214 had drawn attention. Lillian sat upright in her chair when Rebecca entered with the evening medication tray. Rebecca's movements were slower than usual, controlled but edged with tension. Her pale face held no smile now, only a guarded neutrality. "You've had an eventful day," Rebecca said, setting the paper cup of pills on the bedside table. Lillian met her gaze steadily. For weeks she had avoided eye contact during care. This time she did not look away. "I answered a question," she replied. Rebecca's jaw tightened slightly. Misunderstandings can create unnecessary consequences. Before Lillian could respond, a knock sounded at the open doorway. Linda Park stood there, her lavender cardigan wrinkled from a long day. Her usually warm expression looked strained. "Mrs. Johnson, Mr. Whitman would like to speak with you in the conference room." Rebecca stepped aside. The conference room was modest, rectangular table, neutral walls, a framed photograph of the building taken in summer when the lawn was green and inviting. Charles Whitman stood at the head of the table, hands clasped. His composure was intact, but there was urgency beneath it. "Mrs. Johnson," he began smoothly, "we take any concerns very seriously. We can handle this internally. There's no need to escalate matters prematurely." Lillian felt her hands tremble in her lap. The memory of Ava's steady eyes returned to her. "I do not want it handled quietly," she said. Her voice wavered at first, but strengthened as she continued. "I want it addressed properly." Charles exhaled through his nose. "Our internal review process is thorough." "I want to go to court," Lillian said clearly. The words settled heavily in the room. Rebecca, standing near the wall, went pale. It was subtle, the drain of color from her cheeks, but unmistakable. Charles's tone shifted slightly. "Mrs. Johnson, accusations without evidence can harm reputations." Lillian raised her sleeve slowly. The bruises were still visible. "So can silence." News of her decision traveled quickly beyond the building. Ava Thompson, true to her nature, had already contacted a local editor she interned with. Thomas Reed, a seasoned journalist in his early 50s with a rugged build, graying beard, and eyes permanently narrowed by years of investigative reporting. Thomas valued facts over emotion, but he recognized patterns when he saw them. When Ava described the dim corridor and the bruises, he told her quietly, "Document everything." Marcus received the call from Ava just after sunset. He had been sitting at the kitchen table reviewing bills when his phone rang. Ava's voice was calm but urgent. "You should come," she said. "Your mother has decided to file a complaint." Marcus arrived at Willow Creek within 30 minutes, coat half-buttoned, breath visible in the cold evening air. When he entered room 214, and saw the faint discoloration along his mother's arms and shoulder under the lamplight. Something inside him broke. He knelt in front of her. His large hands hovered near the bruises, but did not touch. His voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to worry you," Lillian whispered. Tears fell down Marcus's face freely, something his children had rarely seen. "You're not supposed to protect me," he said. "I'm supposed to protect you." The next morning, legal steps began. Judge Samuel Harper was assigned to review the initial complaint. He was 63 years old, tall and lean, with silver hair combed neatly back and a face defined by measured skepticism. His blue-gray eyes rarely betrayed emotion. He had presided over civil and criminal cases for decades and believed strongly in due process. His upbringing in a rural Midwestern town had instilled in him a belief in fairness, but also in proof. Rather than immediately schedule a full hearing, Judge Harper chose to visit the facility personally to assess the claim. He entered Willow Creek without ceremony, accompanied by a court clerk named Melissa Grant, a quiet woman in her early 30s with short dark curls and a meticulous habit of recording every observation. Charles Whitman greeted the judge with professional composure. "We are cooperating fully," he assured him. Rebecca stood further back than usual, posture stiff. Judge Harper stepped into room 214. He observed the window, the inactive camera, the lighting. His gaze lingered in each corner before settling on Lillian. "You understand the seriousness of your allegation?" he asked evenly. "Yes," she replied. "Are you certain?" The question carried weight, not accusation, but doubt shaped by procedure. "There is no footage," he continued. "No formal report filed at the time of the alleged incidents." Lillian's heart pounded, but she held his gaze. "There are bruises," she said quietly. He examined her arms carefully, nodding slightly as Melissa documented the marks. The bruises were not dramatic, not catastrophic, but they were there. In the hallway, Daniel Brooks stood frozen beside a supply cart. He watched the judge enter and exit the room. His notebook felt heavier in his pocket than it had in weeks. He remembered each timestamp, each locked door. Each moment he had chosen not to intervene. Fear tightened around him again. Fear of retaliation, of losing income, of being labeled disloyal. But guilt pressed harder. That evening, Daniel sat alone in the staff break room long after his shift ended. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. He opened his notebook and reread the entries. His hands trembled. Across town, Margaret O'Connor spoke on the phone with her daughter, Kathleen. Kathleen was in her late 40s, practical and protective. Her voice firm even over distance. "Mom, your health isn't strong," Kathleen said. "You don't need stress." Margaret's response was steady, despite the weakness in her breath. "I saw what I saw." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Margaret had spent years regretting moments when she had stayed silent, during her husband's illness, during institutional decisions that had placed profit over care. She would not repeat that mistake. Back at Willow Creek, Judge Harper concluded his preliminary visit with measured neutrality. "This matter will require formal review," he said. "At this stage, there is no conclusive evidence. No camera footage, no official incident reports. Only testimony." Charles Whitman nodded, relieved at the absence of immediate condemnation. Rebecca exhaled slowly, tension easing just slightly, but the process had begun. In room 214, Lillian sat quietly after the judge left. Marcus remained beside her, his large hand wrapped protectively around hers. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked softly. Lillian looked toward the small window. The gray sky outside had darkened into evening. "Yes," she said. "I am sure." Her voice did not tremble this time. Fear remained. Doubt lingered in the judge's expression. The absence of direct evidence loomed like a shadow. But the silence that had once confined her no longer felt inevitable. The complaint had been spoken aloud, and there would be no turning back. The Cook County Courthouse rose in gray stone against a pale winter sky, its wide steps worn smooth by decades of footsteps seeking justice. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of polished wood and old paper. Courtroom 3B was neither grand nor small. Rows of wooden benches faced the elevated bench where Judge Samuel Harper presided. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, casting an even but unforgiving brightness across every face. Lillian sat at the plaintiff's table beside her attorney, Miss Caroline Hayes. Caroline was in her early 40s, tall and composed, with deep brown skin and neatly braided hair pulled into a low bun. Her posture was upright, her voice measured, and her reputation in civil rights cases had earned her quiet respect. Years earlier, she had represented families in elder neglect cases that were dismissed due to lack of visible harm. That history had shaped her persistence. She did not rely on drama. She relied on precision. Lillian wore a modest navy dress and a soft gray cardigan. Her silver hair was arranged carefully, her hands folded in her lap to steady their trembling. Marcus sat directly behind her, shoulders squared, jaw tight. Ava sat 2 rows back with a small notebook balanced on her knee, her pen poised, but her expression solemn rather than eager. Across the room, Rebecca Collins sat beside the defense counsel. Her once crisp posture seemed rigid now. She wore a dark blazer over a white blouse, her blonde hair tied back tightly. Her face was pale, lips pressed thin. Judge Harper entered, his silver hair combed back as always, expression unreadable. "We are here to review the complaint of Mrs. Lillian Mae Johnson against Willow Creek Senior Living and Ms. Rebecca Collins," he stated calmly. "Proceed." Caroline Hayes rose first. "Your Honor, while there is no camera footage, we will present consistent eyewitness testimony and observable injury patterns that demonstrate misconduct." The defense attorney countered with references to staffing shortages and routine handling procedures. The words, isolated incidents and misinterpretation, surfaced repeatedly. Margaret O'Connor was called to the stand. The courtroom quieted as she rose slowly from her seat. Her thin frame seemed even more fragile beneath the overhead lights. She walked with her cane, its wooden shaft smooth from years of grip, each step deliberate. Her faded green eyes scanned the room briefly before settling on Judge Harper. "State your name," the clerk instructed. "Margaret O'Connor." Her voice trembled at first but gained steadiness as she continued. Caroline approached gently. "Mrs. O'Connor, did you observe any interaction between Miss Collins and Mrs. Johnson?" Margaret inhaled slowly. "Yes." "Please describe what you saw." Margaret's hands tightened around the cane. "One morning, I saw Miss Collins pull Mrs. Johnson's shoulder. Harder than necessary, I know the difference. I've lived here long enough." A pause filled the room. "There was a scratch," Margaret continued. "Right here." She pointed to the upper shoulder area. "It was long and thin. I remember because I dropped my cane that day and bent to pick it up. I saw it clearly." Caroline nodded toward Lillian. Lillian stood carefully and lowered the collar of her cardigan slightly. A faint scar, lighter than the surrounding skin, marked the exact place Margaret indicated. Judge Harper leaned forward slightly. Melissa Grant, seated at the side table, documented the detail precisely. The defense attempted to question Margaret's memory, suggesting confusion due to age. Margaret's chin lifted slightly. "My body is old," she said quietly, "but my eyes still work." A ripple of subdued reaction moved through the benches. Next, Daniel Brooks was called. Daniel approached the stand with visible hesitation. His tall frame seemed awkward beneath the scrutiny of the courtroom. He wore a simple dark suit borrowed from his older cousin, slightly too broad at the shoulders. His hands trembled as he took the oath. "Mr. Brooks," Caroline began, "what is your position at Willow Creek?" "Assistant nurse." "How long have you worked there?" 3 months. "And during that time," Did you observe anything unusual regarding room 214? Daniel swallowed. He glanced briefly toward Rebecca, then toward Lillian. I observed the door to room 214 locked from the outside on multiple occasions, he said. Was that standard protocol? No, he replied. Not for residents who are not designated as wander risk. The courtroom fell still. Did you document this? Yes, Daniel answered, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. His fingers shook slightly as he handed it to the bailiff. Personal notes, dates and times. The defense objected, questioning admissibility, but Judge Harper allowed the record to be reviewed. Rebecca's composure began to fracture. Her eyes darted toward the notebook, then back to the judge. Caroline approached one final time. Mr. Brooks, did you ever witness physical handling that appeared excessive? Daniel hesitated for only a second longer before answering. Yes, I saw Ms. Collins grip Mrs. Johnson's arm tightly. Hard enough to leave marks. Rebecca's attorney rose sharply, challenging credibility, but the pattern was no longer singular. It was layered: bruise, scratch, locked door, consistent observation. Rebecca was called to testify. She walked to the stand with rigid control, shoulders squared. Under questioning, she maintained that all actions were within standard care guidelines. But as Caroline methodically referenced Daniel's notes and Margaret's testimony, inconsistencies surfaced. Were you aware that the camera in room 214 was non-functional? Caroline asked. Yes. For how long? I'm not certain. Did you request immediate repair? I submitted a form. Do you have confirmation? Rebecca hesitated. No. The silence deepened. Finally, under direct questioning from Judge Harper, Rebecca's voice lost its firmness. We are understaffed, she said. Residents can be uncooperative. It's difficult. Difficult, Judge Harper repeated evenly, does not justify harm. Rebecca's shoulders slumped slightly. I never intended harm, she said. The pressure, long shifts. Did you or did you not apply force that resulted in injury? The judge asked. A long pause. Yes, she whispered. But it wasn't abuse. It was stress. The admission hung heavily in the courtroom. Judge Harper removed his glasses briefly, cleaning them with a folded cloth before replacing them. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but firm. This court recognizes that individual misconduct does not occur in isolation. The evidence presented indicates not only inappropriate conduct by Ms. Collins, but also systemic failure in supervision and oversight. A non-functional camera, improper room isolation, and inadequate response mechanisms reflect institutional negligence. He turned slightly toward Charles Whitman, seated behind the defense table. This is not solely about one employee. It is about a system that allowed harm to occur unchecked. Rebecca lowered her head. Lillian sat still, hands folded, heart pounding not with fear now, but with release. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, exhaustion settling into her bones, but relief softening her expression. Daniel exhaled slowly, tension draining from his posture. Marcus's hand rested gently on his mother's shoulder, steady and protective. The courtroom remained silent as the judge concluded the session. In that silence, the truth had weight. And for the first time since room 214 became her address, Lillian felt seen. Winter lingered over Cook County in pale silver mornings, but inside Willow Creek, change moved faster than the season. Within weeks of the court's decision, Rebecca Collins was formally terminated and later charged under state elder protection statutes. Her absence left a silence in the corridor that felt different from the old one, less oppressive, more uncertain. Staff meetings multiplied. Audits began. The once ignored camera in room 214 was replaced entirely, along with several others throughout the facility. Charles Whitman no longer walked the halls with the same quiet confidence. Oversight committees from the state health department visited unannounced. Training sessions were scheduled for all employees focusing on patient dignity, bias awareness, and reporting accountability. Policies were rewritten in thick binders that now sat prominently at the nurses' station instead of hidden in filing cabinets. A new director of nursing was appointed, Sarah Delgado. Sarah was 48, tall and broad-shouldered, with warm olive-toned skin and dark hair streaked with early silver, worn in a short, practical cut. Her face carried the lines of long shifts and difficult decisions, but her eyes were steady and direct. She had previously worked in a veteran rehabilitation center in Milwaukee, where she had confronted staffing shortages without compromising care standards. The experience had shaped her leadership, firm but transparent. On her first day walking the corridors, Sarah paused deliberately outside room 214 before knocking gently. "Mrs. Johnson," she called. Lillian looked up from her chair. She appeared thinner than she had months ago, but her posture was straighter now. "Yes?" Sarah entered with an unhurried presence. "I'm Sarah Delgado. I'll be overseeing care moving forward." She pulled a chair closer rather than standing above Lillian. "I want to hear from you directly. What does comfort mean to you?" It was a simple question, but no one had asked it before. Lillian considered it carefully. "Light," she said at last, "and respect." Within days, she was reassigned to a room in the brighter wing, the one she had first glimpsed from a distance. The new room overlooked a modest courtyard garden. Even in winter, evergreen shrubs framed the path, and a small fountain, currently dry, stood at the center, waiting for spring. The window stretched wide enough for morning sun to spill across the wooden floorboards. When she entered the new space, Lillian paused. The light touched her silver hair gently, illuminating the fine lines in her face not as marks of suffering, but as evidence of survival. Daniel Brooks was among the staff assigned to assist with her transition. He moved more confidently now, though humility remained in his posture. After his testimony, the administration had reviewed his notes and recognized his integrity. He was promoted to a senior care coordinator role, tasked with monitoring compliance and mentoring new assistants. "Mrs. Johnson," he said softly while adjusting her wheelchair brake. "If anything ever feels wrong again, you come directly to me." His voice carried no fear now, only responsibility. Margaret O'Connor was relocated to a nearby room as well. Though still frail, she appeared lighter in spirit. The two women began spending mornings together in the courtyard when weather permitted. Wrapped in thick blankets, they played chess on a portable board balanced between them. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she moved her pieces, but her strategy remained sharp. "I always preferred bishops," she said one morning with a faint smile. "They move quietly, but they change the board." Lillian chuckled softly. "So do old women." Their friendship grew from shared silence into shared laughter. They spoke of childhood streets, of husbands lost, of mistakes and resilience. Sometimes they simply sat facing the pale sun, breathing. Ava Thompson's article was published 2 weeks after the verdict. The headline read, "Silence in the Shadows, Elder Care and Accountability." The piece detailed not only Lillian's experience, but broader systemic gaps in long-term care facilities across the county. Ava's writing was measured, fact-driven, respectful, and free of exaggeration. She included statements from Judge Harper about institutional responsibility and cited data on racial disparities in room assignments and reporting outcomes. The article spread quickly online. Community groups organized forums. Advocacy organizations requested meetings with Willow Creek's new leadership. Thomas Reed, her editor, sent a brief message after publication. "Good reporting changes systems. Keep going." Marcus visited more frequently now, not out of panic, but out of peace. The first time he saw the new room, he stopped just inside the doorway. Sunlight illuminated the small table by the window where Thomas's photograph now stood beside Sophie's drawings. "You like it?" he asked quietly. Lillian looked around slowly. "Yes," she said. I can breathe here." He knelt beside her wheelchair as he had in that earlier moment of grief, but this time his expression held relief rather than despair. In the hallway, residents moved more freely. Doors no longer closed abruptly. Cameras blinked red with steady function. Staff introduced themselves by name and waited for responses before touching patients. It was not perfection, but it was progress. One afternoon, Sarah Delgado gathered the staff for a meeting in the dining hall. "Accountability isn't punishment," she said firmly. "It's protection, for residents and for us. We don't cut corners here anymore." Her tone left no ambiguity. Margaret listened from her wheelchair near the doorway, nodding once. As winter softened toward early spring, the courtyard fountain was restored. The sound of trickling water replaced the memory of locked doors. On a mild afternoon, Marcus arrived with Sophie and Caleb. Sophie carried a small potted daisy plant wrapped in bright paper. Caleb ran ahead, careful not to trip over the paved stones. They found Lillian seated near the fountain beside Margaret. The sunlight filtered warmly through the trees. "Grandma!" Sophie exclaimed, placing the daisy in her lap. Lillian smiled fully, an expression that began in her eyes and spread across her entire face. It was not forced politeness. It was ease. Marcus watched carefully. He had memorized the look of fear months earlier. It was gone. They sat together for a long while. Margaret eventually excused herself to rest, tapping her cane gently against the pavement as she left. Marcus leaned closer to his mother. "You're different," he said softly. Lillian turned toward him. The sunlight caught the edges of her silver hair. "I didn't want to be a burden," she said slowly, "but I also didn't want to live in silence." Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of both truths. For months, fear had lived in room 214. Now, light filled the space she called home. The hallway that once seemed narrow now felt simply like part of a building, no longer a boundary. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long golden beams through the courtyard, Lillian closed her eyes briefly and inhaled. The air was cool but clean. When she opened them again, her smile remained, soft, steady, unguarded. It had been a long time since she had felt peace settle so completely, and in the fading light of that afternoon, her face reflected not survival alone, but dignity restored. This story isn't just about a woman in a nursing home. It's about something closer to us than we'd like to admit. Lillian didn't fight with strength, she fought with truth. She didn't want to be a burden, but she also refused to be invisible. And that's a lesson many of us need to remember. In everyday life, injustice rarely comes loudly. It comes quietly, in soft, contemptuous tones, in doors that close too easily, in systems that appear perfect on the outside but ignore the dangers within. Sometimes it happens to the elderly. Sometimes it happens to those in need. Sometimes it happens to anyone who is considered too weak to fight back. The educational message is simple yet powerful. Dignity doesn't diminish with age. Respect isn't optional. Silence often protects the wrongdoers more than it protects the right ones. If you work in healthcare, education, public service, or any position of responsibility, remember that power is not permission. It is accountability. Stress is not a justification for cruelty. Systems need to be examined, not blindly defended. If you are a son or daughter, don't just ask, "Is mom/dad okay?" Look closely. Listen deeply. Courage sometimes begins with a sincere question. If you feel small, left out, or afraid to speak up, remember Lillian. A voice, however shaky, can change an entire institution. We also need to talk about bias. Racism isn't always obvious. Sometimes it's hidden in who gets to sit in the brighter room and who is told to accept what's presented. Ending discrimination requires awareness, honesty, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Let this story gently challenge us. Visit the elderly. Speak up for justice. Denounce wrongdoing. Encourage what is right. Choose courage over convenience. If this story resonates with you, share it with those who believe in dignity and justice. Leave a comment and let us know where you are watching from. Let us know what lessons resonate with you. Subscribe to the channel if you believe stories can awaken consciences and strengthen communities. Your support helps more voices be heard. And may God protect all elders who feel forgotten, all workers who choose integrity over fear, and all families seeking peace. If you believe that truth brings light even to the darkest rooms, write Amen in the comments.